U.S. History Review, Lesson 29, The First World War, 1914 to 1919. Discussing the First World War obviously brings us into international affairs. Briefly, we've been well, not briefly, but for a significant amount of time, we'd done some things in international affairs with the imperialism unit, but we'd seen prior to that no real involvement in foreign affairs since some of your reviews or your class studies of the War of 1812. Even the Civil War doesn't really count as too much with international policy, even though clearly international policies played a role in shaping the Lincoln administration's works. The origins of the First World War will take us out of the United States for just a second, just long enough to square a few things to you on some basic ground rules of what went where. So to discuss a few things, notice our map up here for today does not have the United States on it at all, unless you include that small little insert up there. The First World War begins in Europe for a number of reasons that involve competing empires, competing nations, nationalism, militarism, competing over colonies and resources, secret alliances that all the great power nations had, but the explicit spark that sets it off is the assassination of the crown prince to the throne of the nation of Austria-Hungary, Franz Ferdinand, who was shot and killed in Sarajevo, down near Serbia. Serbia had been trying to get these lands of Bosnia and Sarajevo and Herzegovina for itself. And so as such, this was essentially a terrorist act. To make a long story short, the Austrians pressured the Serbs and began mobilizing troops to force a conflict with them to resolve this issue. Serbia had alliances with the Russians, the Russian Empire, which had historically seen itself as being the preserver of the rights and protectors of these people of the Balkans. As Russia begins to mobilize, the Germans begin to mobilize. Germany, of course, having an alliance with Austria-Hungary, not wanting to see them get picked on by the Russians. It turns into a continuous game of pick on someone your own size. And so this chain of events through these secret treaties leads to the entire nation of Europe, or the entire continent of Europe rather, almost being pulled into a conflict because of one unrelated event down in the Balkans. Because with Russia's mobilization, as Germany prepares to face them, the Russians had a treaty of alliance with the French. The Germans, as you can see from the map, don't want to get caught in a vice of having to fight what's going to be a two-front war. So their plan for victory was to strike a hammer blow, knock the French out first, because they were the smaller, more compact, more dangerous nation, and then turn their forces and redeploy and be ready to take on the massive Russian forces they knew were bound to come. Part of the secret plan of theirs, the so-called Schlieffen plan, was to sneak through a place, to smash through a place where the French never expected them to come, through neutral Belgium. By smashing through Belgium, the Belgians then fight and resist, and Belgium had a treaty of alliance with Great Britain, which brings Great Britain into the war. So long story short, you have the entire continent ablaze in a very short period through this process. The war these people wound up fighting was not the war they thought they were getting. The Europeans learned some of the lessons that the Americans had learned the very hard way during the Civil War about industrialized modern warfare with mass armies. The weapons of the First World War that transform war will be things such as the trench warfare, the machine gun, armor makes its appearance. Defense is now stronger than attack. And so you have war and slaughter and carnage on a scale the likes of which the world had never seen before. Poison gas and chemical warfare plays a role in the birth of aviation in many ways, though aviation will be far more significant in the Second World War than the First. But it's enough for us to understand that you have a massive continent-wide war going on, and all of the weapons and power and industrial capacity of these nations, which in earlier chapters had been turned loose in imperializing and colonizing the rest of the globe, is now being set loose upon one another. And the fights wind up becoming a stalemate. As we said, with barbed wire and entrenched fixed machine gun positions, defense is now stronger than attack during this cycle. For the United States, our own foreign policy during this time, the initial feeling of the United States about the war in Europe is that we are thankful that it's not here. And our initial foreign policy positions are going to be neutrality from the Wilson administration, and then trying to do some things, if possible, to end the conflict, try to act as a mediator, try to bring peace. Ultimately, this will fail. This will not be as sustainable because of four key reasons. Historically, the United States, there were ties between the Allies and the Americans. And more important than that, we've got to go back to your map, look at geography. If you look at the nations that helped in many ways, the Anglo-Saxon culture that established the United States from Jamestown and Massachusetts Bay, looking at the map, even if we were going to have financial ties and commercial ties with the center areas of the continent, which we did get a lot of immigrants from during our waves of immigration, we talked about that, it's going to be difficult once they're at war because geographically they're rather easily bottled up. You've got the English Channel as their outlet, you've got the North Sea as their outlet, or all the way around the Mediterranean, all of which are going to be controlled by their opponents, the so-called allies, which were these pink nations here. Not Africa, those are colonial holdings, but you're talking France, England, Italy, the Balkan nations down here in Russia were stacked up against the Central Powers of the Ottoman Empire, modern-day Turkey, and then Austria-Hungary and Germany. It's going to be very difficult for us to actually engage in significant political and economic discourse with the Central Powers of the continent because they are central. They're easily bottled up. Now, with that being the case, there were, of course, American historic ties, but commercial ties, even if we were going to be neutral, it was simply going to be easier for us to engage in loans and finance and commerce with France and Britain, who are already on the Atlantic Ocean. American public opinion of Germany wound up being negative as well because Germany was viewed largely as the aggressor state because of what's going to be seen in their submarine policies, and also what they're going to do is they ram through neutral Belgium and destroy this neutral nation on their way to fight this war that they're fighting. So the key thing, though, more and above anything else, which I'm sure you're aware from your courses, is going to be German submarine policy. What the Germans were looking to do was try to even the score in terms of economic gains. The Allies tried to to starve out the Central Powers, cut them off from outside trade, which was easy for them to do. The Straits of the English Channel, the Dover Straits, are only about 8-10 miles wide as it is, so it's very easy for the British and the French to patrol that. And from the North Sea, the British laid this enormous minefield that only they have the directions through. And anyone trying to go through that minefield has to consult with the British and ask them. The first thing the British are going to ask is, what are you carrying and where are you going? And they refuse passage through of cargoes to Germany. The Germans are frustrated by this, the Central Powers are, and so they seek to even the score by using the new modern weapon of the 20th century, the submarine, the U-boat, the undersea boat. What they say is they make a public proclamation declaring that all the waters around Great Britain are a war zone, and as such, any vessel entering those waters runs the risk of being sunk without warning. And the best way not to be sunk is to not go in those areas, and they say to avoid unfortunate mistakes, neutral vessels should stay out of the zone, and citizens of neutral nations should not travel on Allied ships. Of course, the United States pitches a fit on this. This gets us back to 1812 and the freedom of the seas, the same thing that got us in trouble during the Napoleonic Wars. Wilson takes the position that the United States, as a neutral nation, has the right to sail and trade with whoever we want. We're mad at the British for the blockade. We're mad at the British for the North Sea minefield, mad at the British for not allowing us to trade with the Germans. But what the Germans are doing is of far more consequence because our cargoes going to stop by the Allies simply get seized, impounded, or turned back. The German solution winds up with destruction of ships, property, and lives, things that can't get back because it gets sent under the water. So ultimately, we engage with the Germans in a struggle to ask for visit and search. We want them to stop and search the ships and not, use their U-boat as an attack weapon in this manner and sink it without warning. The biggest example of why is when the ocean liner Lusitania gets sunk about 7-8 miles off the coast of Ireland in 1915. When the Lusitania sinks, it's torpedoed twice by a German U-boat, sinks in about 18 minutes. It's almost as much a loss of life as there was in the Titanic. Nearly 1,100, almost 1,200 people are killed, 128 of them are Americans, and some 20 infants die in this. And this is seen as an utterly uncivilized and barbarous act by the United States, and we nearly threaten to cut off diplomatic relations with the Germans. The Germans ultimately promised to vow what they call the Sussex Pledge. They promised not to sink any more ships without warning. And it's through this time period that our relations with Germany kind of simmer a little bit, but we still see them as a result of this publicity as being negative, the aggressor state, and not part of the problem for why the First World War takes place.